3,600 are injured after an explosion in downtown Beirut earlier on Tuesday. We're joined by Bloomberg's Noueihed, who was on the ground during the explosion, is joining us live from Beirut to discuss your experience and what we know now and what's developing. Lynn, thank you for joining us. I'm so glad to see that you are safe. How have you been doing today, and what has it been like being on the ground during all of this?
It's been quite a shocking day. As a journalist covering the Middle East, I mean, I've covered lots of explosions and blasts and car bombs, sadly, and so on in the past. But I actually have never seen anything on this scale. The size of the explosion was felt so all over the city. I mean, where I live is 7 or 8 kilometers away from where the blast took place. Windows were broken, shop fronts were shattered, people were injured, people's windows and doors were blown into their homes, and the hospitals were really overwhelmed. I went to a number of hospitals, and emergency rooms were overwhelmed. They were only letting in the most serious cases. Other people were being left in the waiting rooms. People were being treated on blankets in the corridors. It was really overwhelming. Blood all over the floor, and people were really in a state of shock.
Lynn, right now we're looking at footage that you shot yourself on the ground earlier today. Can you tell us a bit about what we're seeing?
Yeah, these are images that were shot at the Clemenceau Medical Center, which is a private hospital in the Hamra area, which is about 7 kilometers or so away from the blast site. A lot of these people were injured in their homes from shattered glass. A lot of walking wounded, but a lot of glass injuries. Because my mother was also hurt by glass that was shattered in her apartment. We were taking her to the hospital, and these are the images that were. It was a scene of chaos. There was just ambulances showing up, people coming in with all kinds of injuries, and the ER was, turning people away pretty much because it was difficult for them to cope.
You mentioned that your mother was injured. Can you tell us how she and how your family are doing?
They're fine. Thankfully, just got back from the hospital. We had to take her to a hospital outside of Beirut because the Beirut hospitals were really overwhelmed, and they were only taking super serious cases. And thankfully, her case wasn't serious, and she needed some stitches, in her head. Because she was hit by the glass that the windows with the sliding doors of their apartment were blown open by the force of the explosion. But she's fine now. So
we're so glad to hear that you are safe and your family is safe. You mentioned being at several of these hospitals. Can you tell us, is there any more information about the numbers here? Do we know any more about how many are expected to be dead and how many are injured?
I can't say how many are expected to be dead, but I think the latest I heard was at least 70 killed and thousands actually wounded. I mean, if you include all the walking wounded, there's lots and lots of people with slight injuries, and I would imagine that the death toll would increase. There are lots of residential areas that are relatively near the port where the damages have been really, quite horrendous. People's homes have pretty much collapsed and fallen in on them. So I should imagine, sadly, that we'll hear the casualty toll will probably rise.
And we should mention to our audience that, of course, this is developing as we are talking about it. But as far as you know right now, Lynn, what do we know about how this occurred?
So the government is saying that there was an explosion at a warehouse at the port where some explosive materials that have been confiscated were being stored. There have been some warnings about nitrates being released into the air, and people have been told to be careful about the air being polluted by the explosion. But in fact, we don't really know the exact details yet. And obviously, as always, there are always lots of rumors and lots of speculation. A lot of people are in kind of are struggling to believe that this is an accident, and lots of people, as you know, Lebanon's history is one where people are accustomed to political violence, car bombs, and so on. And their natural first reaction was that this was an attack of some kind. But we don't know yet. The details are still, investigations are ongoing.
You mentioned the history of the area. Can you share with our audience a little more context about what Beirut and Lebanon have been going through, both, financially and politically at the current moment?
Yeah, well, actually, this explosion, whatever caused it, couldn't have come at a worse time for Lebanon and the Lebanese. The country is going through the worst financial crisis in its history. The government's defaulted on billions of dollars worth of bonds. Inflation is in food inflation is in triple figures. People are struggling to make ends meet. People who've had their savings in the bank wiped out basically by this financial crisis. Unemployment has soared. Companies have been closing down. So the country was already struggling. And also in the last few days, the government had announced a new lockdown because the number of cases of coronavirus had begun to rise again after the earlier lockdown in April and May in the spring began to be eased. So the lockdown also had been adding to the political pressure. And today was one of 2 days that the government had allowed businesses and shops to open, to allow people just to, do those last bits and pieces of business that they need to finish off, as we're expecting the lockdown to come in, to become stricter in the coming days. And so the streets were actually full of people, trying to make the most of that kind of last couple of days of being able to do shopping or do whatever before the lockdown came back. So it's been a really difficult time. Lebanon also, there were mass protests in October, November against decades of corruption that people believe caused the financial crisis. And, those had petered out, but it definitely feels for the Lebanese like it's been one thing after another. And there have been a lot of fears about financial collapse, about hunger, even about war with Israel. But this wasn't really on people's, this came as such a shock to people today.
And just to dig into one of the things that you mentioned and that you wrote about in your piece is that this came in a 2-day grace period. Can you talk to us a little bit more about that? Were people leaving their homes, presumably for the first time in some time?
So Lebanon had eased the lockdown in recent weeks, and last week it reimposed restrictions. So lots of shops have been closed, and businesses have been closed, hotels, bars, and so on. And the government had allowed 2 days of, for the economy to reopen again, just to give people some breathing space. And Thursday was going to be the beginning of a super strict lockdown with a curfew and no leaving your home. So, people were trying to take advantage of these 2 days to get any business they needed to get done, any shopping they needed to get done, in expectation of not being able to leave the house. Starting Thursday, there was going to be a curfew. So yeah, people were out and about basically. Although it happened towards the end of the day, so the number of workers at the port and in surrounding areas would have been a little bit reduced, less than it would have been during the middle of the day, but nevertheless.
And you visited several hospitals in the area earlier today. We are in the middle of the global pandemic, right? What precautions did you see occurring at these hospitals?
A lot of people were wearing face masks, but you know, it was chaos. People were panicking. As you can see from the images, I mean, there's blood on the floor, glass on the floor, debris. There are some hospitals that were damaged themselves, that were close to the, were closer than the ones I visited to the scene of the explosion, and weren't able to take as many casualties as others because, the buildings were physically damaged. So it's it's been people did try and keep their masks on, but and there's blood everywhere, and it's just difficult to get your hands on the right supplies.
Right. And Lynn, you're covering this as a journalist, but you're also there as a person. What has that been like for you, and how are you doing?
It's been quite a day. I when the explosion happened, I was working from home because of COVID. Obviously, it felt initially like an earthquake, and so I, went to take cover, and then we heard the massive explosion, and alarms started going off, windows shattering, and I have two children, and they were out on a play date, and so my first thought was to try and find out what where the children were and to make sure that they were safe. But obviously, when these explosions happen, a lot of the phone lines go down. So for the first kind of half an hour to an hour, it's actually quite hard to get hold of people and find out if people are okay. So that was the most stressful kind of stretch for me, where I couldn't find out whether the kids were fine, but then they were fine, and then I started calling around other family members to see if everyone was okay, and then, to be honest, the sound and the impact of the blast initially made me think that it was very close to where I was, and it was only through making calls to people all around Beirut that it began to sink in, and I began to realize the reach and the extent of the damage all over the city. And before I found out that it was the explosion was at the port, which was surprising because the extent of the damage in different parts of Beirut was really quite staggering.
Lynn, it's just so heartbreaking to hear your experience of this, and I'm so glad to hear that you and your family are okay. You have had an incredibly difficult day, so we are going to let you go, but we are so thankful to you for joining us and sharing your coverage with us, and I know that you'll keep our audience updated as we learn more about this. And for folks watching, please follow Bloomberg Quick Take on all social platforms, wherever you get your news, to get those updates from us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks. Take care.